Hello, everyone. My name is Graham Dixon, and I've got the privilege of being moderator for this final session for this conference. I'm grateful to the Sepsum and Lekwungen nations upon whose unceded lands I have the privilege to live and work. So welcome, everyone, to this final session, in which we're going to explore the challenge of leading change to modernize clinical trials in British Columbia. As you participate, I'd ask you to contemplate this question. Given this is the first day of the rest of our lives, what am I going to do to accomplish the modernization goal? Now, this is a panel session. We're privileged to have with us an esteemed group of 8 panel members who are going to share their thoughts with you on the modernization theme. You'll recognize them as moderators of previous sessions or participants in those sessions. Now, before I give you an overview of how this last hour and a half is going to unfold, first let me ask the panel members to give a brief introduction of themselves, and then I'll describe the process we're going to follow. I'll start with you, Gavin, if I may. Can you tell us a little about yourself?
Hi, I'm Gavin Stewart. I'm a professor at UBC and an academic gynecologist working in the area of clinical trials nationally and internationally.
Thank you. Danielle.
Good afternoon. I'm Danielle Lavallee. I'm the scientific director for the BC Academic Health Science Network, an associate professor at the University of Washington Department of Surgery, and generally a fan of all things patient-oriented research and learning health systems. So happy to be here today.
Thank you, Danielle. Rob?
I'm Rob McMaster. I'm Vice Dean of Research for the Faculty of Medicine at UBC, and I've been the chair of the Clinical Trials BC Advisory Council for the last 2 years. And prior to that, with everybody else, most on the screen, involved with BC CRIN, the precursor. I've also been on the CHR, the National Steering Committee for Patient-Oriented Research, and really really appreciated the growth over the last 10 years of what we've seen in many different areas, both in the technology of clinical trials and particularly the patient engagement. We look forward to this discussion.
Thanks, Rob. Heidi.
Heidi Scott. I live rurally in Fruitvale in the West Kootenays of BC farm, and I think that context is important. So I'm a patient partner. I'm involved in quite a large number of different initiatives, both local and provincially.
Thanks, Heidi.
I guess importantly, sorry, one last thing I forgot. I've been a participant in a drug trial and in epidemiological studies as well.
Yeah, thank you.
Sorry.
Srin.
Hi, I'm Srinivas Murthy. I'm a clinical intensive care provider here in Vancouver, Canada, as well as a clinical researcher. Much of my work has been on innovative clinical trials, and I've been busy during this pandemic trying to roll out a number of clinical trials.
I can imagine. Allison.
Hi, everyone. I'm Alison Orth, Unit Director with Clinical Trials BC. It's my privilege to be here with everyone today. And I think a perspective I'm hopefully bringing to the panel is from many years working as a research coordinator and research site manager, trying to support the conduct of clinical trials.
Super. Cindy. Mute, Cindy.
Oh, that's better. Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm here with you today because as a clinical research associate right out of grad school in 1988 into a career path I had no idea existed while in school. And in that era, data was collected on triplicate paper case report forms. Since then, I've both led and ridden the waves of change into my current role as the Director of Research at Island Health, where I joined you today from the traditional territories of the Songhees and Esquimalt nations.
Thank you, Cindy, and thank you all panel members for that introduction. It's really interesting to note that we really have a subsection of the system M-paneled here for you to hear from today. So if we want a system solution, we're going to get it from this group of 8. So here's how the process for this final session will go. We're going to ask each of the panel members in 2 groups of 4 to answer the question, what does the modernization of the clinical trials process in British Columbia mean to you? After each group of 4 has given you about a 3-minute explanation or an answer to that question, we're going to ask each of you in the audience to join us in a dialogue on the chat box or to ask questions in the Q&A section of the 4 panel members involved in that particular section of the talk. The first 4 will be Gavin, Danielle, Rob, and Jean. The second 4 will be Heidi. Oh, let's see. Who's next? Srin, Allison, and Cindy. They will also have, after their talk, a short audience participation. We're then going to ask you, the audience, to answer a poll question that we're going to give you on the scope and breadth of change that their talks presage for the challenge of modernization of clinical trials in BC. In other words, the scope and breadth of the change you think that they're sort of proposing as the way forward. Once the poll is complete, each of the panel members is going to be asked to come back and comment very quickly on the poll results, whether it agrees with their own perspective or not. And one thing that they're going to do differently, starting tomorrow, as a first step in modernization of the clinical trial process in British Columbia. We're going to then end by asking you, the audience, to tell us what you are prepared to do to help us co-create the modernized clinical trials process that all of us, I think, believe is important to achieve. That will then take us to the end of the conference, and we will turn it over to the conference organizers to give us a summation. So now it's my privilege to ask the 4 panel members in the first group, Gavin, Danielle, Rob, and I keep forgetting the order, but Jean, thanks Jean, to give us their perspective on what does modernization of clinical trial process in BC look like to you? Gavin.
Thanks very much, Graham. Before I jump in, do you wish Jean to introduce herself?
Oh, I could say a few words. I could simply say that I'm a professor emeritus at Railroad University in British Columbia. Do work with the Canadian Health Leadership Network, Canadian College of Health Leaders, and was the principal investigator in the work to create the LEADS framework. And love the application of leadership to challenges like this. Thanks, Gavin.
Thank you. And Jean?
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Jean Smart. I'm the conference chair. I guess I'm slightly unforgettable. Just kidding. I'm the Regulatory Affairs Officer for Clinical Trials BC and the Privacy Officer for BC HSN. I come from a background of global health and international development with a focus on governance, policy, and obviously regulation. My interest has mostly been in implementation of research models and preparedness and readiness for compliance, especially in undeveloped countries. But I have been involved in the modernization of clinical trials project at the global level from its inception over a decade ago. That's how long it takes things to go through. I'm really happy to be here today.
Thanks, Jean. And Gavin, great catch. Thank you.
Well, I just wanted to make sure we would never, ever describe Jean as forgettable.
Yeah, no, exactly.
So thanks very much, Graham, for your question. I guess I've just used half my time, but so what does modernization look like from my perspective of clinical trials? I will say first and foremost, I don't view modernization as an event. I view it as a process or an evolution. And I think it needs to continue to evolve as we generate evidence to inform our healthcare system to produce better outcomes. And I hope we all agree that clinical trials are one of the best ways of producing solid evidence to inform practice, to assess better outcomes, and help the population that we're here to serve. There are a number of different touch points that I could talk about, but I'm going to just land on three. Number one is, I think we've heard throughout the last couple of days, clinical trials in many ways have been elite, in isolation, sequestered, and we really do need to open that up such that clinical trials are driven as much by patients and partners as they are by the scientists, the clinicians, the statisticians, and so on. And somebody made the observation earlier today, I mean, of all of those patients who have willingly and voluntarily signed up for clinical trials in the last 10 years, how many of them actually knew the results of the clinical trial? I mean, we've got to have them throughout the process, and that's a fundamental change that I personally will ensure that we drive ahead with. The second piece relates to data and operationalization of databases across jurisdictions. I have said on many occasions in British Columbia, we are very privileged. We have a lot of data. It's just, it doesn't talk. And we really need in the domain of clinical trials to ensure that this is not a time to sequester and silo data, but rather to allow collectively the investigators, the patients, the health systems people to access and interpret those data. And then the third piece is we've had a lot of conversation around systems. I think we can call it a variety of different things. Some people say closing the loop. Some people talk about a learning health system. But somehow those results from clinical trials need to be reflected in the delivery of care, which is then evaluated in a way that is going to create the next set of questions to be assessed in clinical trials. I think we have heard a lot of people agree with that, but we haven't done that yet. And that's, I think, foundational to the BC Academic Health Science Network. So that's what I'll say, Graham. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gavin. That's contemplating the challenge of creating a learning health system. I think it is quite a challenge from where we are now to what we might become. But it's not my job to talk. It's my job to enable others to talk. So Danielle, it's your turn. Would you like to share your thoughts with us?
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity. And I think I agree with Gavin in the sense that there's a number of touch points, but I'm actually just going to focus primarily on one. I've been reflecting on this question in terms of what does modernization look like? And initially my reaction was, learning health systems and advancing the types of trials that we're doing in the conduct of clinical care. But at the same time, that felt like a linear process, that there's a next step in terms of how you get better. And I think that it's towards the goal of making research more patient-centered, better aligned with care decisions, and more efficient. And while I think those listed drivers are spot on, I would offer that modernization, in my opinion, and I think based on some of the conversations I've heard to date, is really about knitting together our communities to address the challenges that we're facing. I'm going to pause for one quick second because I hear a lot of background. Do you guys hear background on my end too? Is it still there? I have an echo throughout the whole conference, which is giving me a bit of a complex. I'm gonna just put a note in the presenter chat and see if that can help. Let's see, is that any better? Is it better for you guys? Okay, good.
Yeah, I'm not hearing it, Danielle.
So I do believe that we're all working towards a goal of advancing patient care, but the language, and I've heard that resonate a lot throughout the past couple of days, the language that we use and the networks that we pull from are quite different. So yesterday, I was really struck by the ways in which this came up. And in fact, Gavin, I think you used the word lexicon, and that really resonated with me. So here's a great example. quality improvement. If you look up the definition for quality improvement, it's a systematic, formal approach to analysis of practice performance and efforts to improve performance. We expect this process of evaluation to happen within our health systems as patients, as providers, as people that are of the public. We want to make sure that our systems are learning and providing the best care possible. So now let's take the word research, and as defined, it's a systematic investigation and study in order to establish facts and reach conclusions. Very similar as defined, but the word research often evokes very different responses. And I think, Heidi, in your lunch bite, you brought up the component of distrust, and certainly there's a large history of that. But it also requires very different pathways for conduct if we're doing QI versus research, but our goals are similar: to provide care, to improve the care that we're providing, and to learn.
Oh, there she is.
So I think that there's, it's important to me. I think the example of how language that we use creates a barrier for us to see and work together towards common goals. So I think if we don't address this aspect of our respective work, then in the next 5 years, we'll have new technologies and new treatments, but we'll still be facing the same challenges and frustrations. So those are my thoughts to add to the discussion.
Thanks very much, Danielle. I love the phrase knitting us together in going ahead, and I'm very thoughtful about the challenges implicit in doing that. I think they are somewhat prodigious, but it's a marvelous notion. Next, Rob, it's your turn. Would you like to give us your thoughts?
Sure, thank you. So a large piece of, a view of modernization of clinical trials falls under innovation. And what we've seen the last 3 days is innovation in several different areas. We've seen innovation in design of clinical trials, in technology of clinical trials, and also really innovation in patient engagement and really involving people in clinical trials. Clinical trials are part of the continuum of research. You can start at one end, say, as fundamental or discovery research. We have clinical research, which have been translated into practice. A piece of that is commercialization, whether it's in drug development or medical devices. They all need to be assessed through clinical trials. So it's very important that it's as a piece of the continuum, and it's not thought to be isolated from other aspects of research across the spectrum. So with regards to innovation, we've seen a number of examples. I've just broken them down into a few. One is on technology. And a lot of these are also to understand the progress of disease or where clinical trials are hopefully mitigating that or preventing it in the first place. We've seen innovation in imaging, where we shorten the timeline of endpoints, which again is beneficial to patients to know that they're responding to a treatment or not responding, so they're not continuing drugs, and also a much further understanding of the disease progress and how to stop that. I think we've all heard a lot about precision health or precision medicine, where we use a number of different technologies to assess making medicine treatments more precise. And we also should include in this also precision health for prevention of disease. And genomic plays a big role in this, of understanding how our genes interact either with each other or in response to therapy. And what we've seen is the stratification of many diseases into subgroups which have their own treatments. And particularly, as some of the examples were in cancer, of how that changes during the course of disease, that the treatment also can be predicted to change based on some of the precision points. Digital health is clearly very important. We've seen that the real pivot of digital health, particularly with COVID, on care, of now shortening the or eliminating the need for face-to-face interactions and relying on technology. But also in clinical trials, it enables a digital approach, whether it's on data or bringing people together, serving remote access and having inclusivity in participants. I think digital health is really moving forward in participation of clinical research. And that also is an innovation on some of the other aspects of when you look at sensors, et cetera, that much can be done remotely rather than relying on coming back to centers for assessment or for following up. And so again, it's seeing the technology really driving clinical trials. We saw the innovation, the power of networks, and this is involving people. of the importance of having networks across, whether it's across BC or across Canada or even internationally. And those networks are composed of many different groups, whether they're clinical groups, but they are actually not meeting in isolation of each other. And we saw the real power from some of the networks of patient engagement, of really setting the, what are the needs within the system that clinical trials had addressed, as opposed to the opposite of, well, we'll have clinical trials, we'll find a use for them at the other end of when we show something that's successful. And this relates to the innovation in people engagement. And I think it's been really, we've seen a lot through the last few days of the increase, and it's not just the increase in awareness, it's also the power that patient engagement brings to clinical trials. And we have the REACH platform, for example, of bringing knowledge to the public and also to investigators and having it as a two-way conversation. So really innovation is, it is driving clinical trials in many different aspects. And as we all know, the challenge of innovation, and I think that's the next question, is then how do we make sure that it's actually implemented in the system, which really look forward to some of the input from everybody of how we can move forward on ensuring that the innovation in clinical trials leads to better patient outcomes. Thank you.
Thanks, Rob. And I'd love to combine your list of innovative practices with Danielle's notion of knitting together, because how do they all work together? How can we knit them together in some kind of a holistic way? And before I introduce Jean, who I have deep apologies to for forgetting her earlier, I'd just like to remind everybody that we would welcome your questions in the Q&A forum, because there will be a short Q&A after Jean has finished talking, so please feel free to throw them in. And Jean, without further ado, I'm dying to hear what you have to say.
Not always everybody is. Bringing the regulatory lens. I think why we do research is clear. The principles on which research stands are solid. There is, however, a critical modernization, and I mentioned it took 10 years, and renovation underway. And it's to the foundational supporting guidelines and regulations for clinical trials and research. And I think we're at the time of implementation. That's the what. Past regulation and policy, and certainly the older governance models, came from medical-centric in a thou shalt model. And I'm referring to the Declaration of Helsinki, ICH, and even our now 70-year-old Health Canada regulations. They kind of look like Swiss cheese now because of all the repeals. So coming from a place of archaic, rigid guidelines, we're moving to the new changes at the international level. And this is really interesting because these were driven not from inside, but for the first time from wide global stakeholder and participant, patient input. And it's been a global approach with the inclusion of regions, many with no healthcare system and certainly no learning health system model or other guidelines even. And the inclusion of the unrepresented, it's been one of the widest and lengthiest consultation periods and processes involved in research on record. So now we're left with the what. So what's happening, what's coming in terms of international law and regulation. We have ongoing support of the regulatory submission, the usual governance and products for ethics, safety, quality of the product, and quality of the data, but with a wider application of the guidances to clinical trials and research in general. So basically, this is where good clinical practice now becomes good research practice. The critical interplay of the factors of quality by design come in as a major, and basically we want good quality data from a validated database to, if we're going to be making decisions for learning health systems and for products, we want to make sure that it's sound decision making from sound data. We have increased data sources now, which is wonderful in the regulations, including surveillance data, pragmatic clinical trials, real world trials. And that's enabled, I think, by things that Rob's talking about, digitalization of processes and information. We have new statistical principles, methodology, and trial designs. We have, most importantly, the inclusion of diversity of peoples, and we heard some great talks on that yesterday afternoon, or Tuesday afternoon, from the underrepresented, rural, remote, older adults, pediatrics, and women, and LGBTQ+. I guess Surin has had a lot to say about multi-regional clinical trial approach, and we weren't quite ready for that. And then lastly, the engagement of patients. So for me, I think we're at the how stage. How are we going to implement this and make changes in Canada and here in BC?
Thank you very much, Jean. A really important point, I think, is now the action phase. In other words, we've heard a lot about what we should do and can do. Now, how are we going to do it? And with that, I'd like to thank the four of you who put your perspectives forward in this first session, and invite the audience to provide us with a couple of questions. We've only got 2 or 3 minutes before I've got to move on to the next panel group. But if there are 1 or 2 questions, please don't hesitate to give us the wisdom that you possess out there. In the meantime, in the absence of a question, I'm really taken by this notion of knitting together disparate enterprises, whether they be organizations, whether they be groups of people, whether they be bringing in people from diverse backgrounds. And I'm wondering what you people have to say about how challenging do you think that's going to be moving forward? I mean, is it an easy thing to change the existing culture to embrace that notion? Does anybody want to comment?
I'll comment and first give a shout out to Terry Fleming for my knitting reference. But I would say that I'm an eternal optimist, and one of the things probably amongst this panel being the newest to BC is I'm so impressed by the collegiality and collaboration in this community. So while I may say it would be very difficult in certain environments or certain places, I think it's actually quite feasible here, and this is the right time to do it. COVID, as we all know, has brought a lot of horrible things to light, but I also think it's really shown a great strength and light in this province in particular about how people do come together and really can drive change. So I don't think it's as difficult today as it might have been 5 years ago, and certainly not in this province. I think there's great potential here, but that's my view.
So when we throw on the lens, though, of not just within the province, but across Canada or internationally, anybody want to comment on that? Because we're going to have to have processes in place to do that in a more, rather than a one-off situation, right? We're going to have to have processes that enable that to happen on an ongoing basis, just like the learning system will need those. So just a point that some of the processes that are going to need to be employed, I think, are going to be incredibly important for that to happen. So let me now invite the next 4 panel members to share their thoughts on the question of modernization of clinical trials in British Columbia, what their perspectives are. And in this group, we're going to have Heidi, we're going to have Surin, Allison, and Cindy. And Heidi, it's your turn. You want to start us off?
So I can't speak to the processes of how to modernize, but what I think I can do is help provide a vision of what the end result should be. So my dream is that patients end up feeling supported and cared for in every step of the research process. Patients are never treated as guinea pigs by the research team, and that includes by drug companies. We want results communicated to us in a language we can understand. But also some of us want the gory details. So I personally want the published results without having to worry about a paywall. We really want to see those trial results make a difference in the real world too. So if there's negative results, I want to see them published so other researchers don't go down dead ends. If there are positive results, I want to see them get into clinical practice. I've seen firsthand examples of where that's not happening. In particular, prior to the pandemic, I was supporting an MS support group. And I was shocked to hear how many neurologists were not embracing time as brain, which is, fundamental today to the treatment of MS. And it means that we get very different levels of care based on who is kind of involved in the research community and who is not. Another example is that I know somebody who used to be a drug rep, and he told me the thing that he liked most about his job was getting to educate physicians about new drugs. And his specific example was a Parkinson's drug. I, as a patient, do not want to hear that my physician is learning about drugs from a drug rep. That decreases our trust in the system. And yes, this was in Canada. So I want a world where the public believe in the results of research studies and that they don't have a concern that big pharma is dictating those results. So I think, as has come up many times in the last couple of days, is patients need to be a part of the research team every step of the way to change this. So we can help guide what the questions are. We want you to be willing to learn from us. I mean, I have been directly told, physicians don't want to learn from their patients. And I don't think that that's universally true, but it is sometimes. And I think the same thing happens in the research community at times. We can help you identify barriers and provide suggestions on how to overcome them. We can do really practical things like help you put together a frequently asked questions. We can help with communication strategies, recruiting. That's a really important one. Patients who have had a positive experience are going to be your best advocates to recruiting to your study. I'd like to kind of finish this off with one piece of advice about patient engagement, and that is be respectful. Treat us as equals if you want the maximum benefit out of our participation.
Thank you, Heidi. A great way to end your talk, because I would hope that that would be an element of every relationship that exists within our system and hasn't always been there. Thank you. Sren, your turn.
It's always impossible to follow Heidi. That was excellent. When I think about, I guess, the question and modernizing and how to move forward, and people ask me these questions because I do clinical trials, but then I think about my clinical practice and how I make decisions in day-to-day life, and how I sort of engage patients in, do you want X drug? Should we do Y thing? And that shared decision-making process that goes into every patient-doctor interaction. And if our goal ultimately is to bring those clinical trials and research towards a idealized norm of clinical practice, and we have a fundamental framework of shared decision-making in practice, then effectively what we need to do is build that shared decision-making framework for clinical research and clinical trials. And that sort of comes from a variety of different perspectives. It comes from the top, namely our funders, our research ethics boards, our regulators, saying that this is how you do research because it's embedded within making patients better. It also comes from, not the bottom, but a separate side of things, namely the clinicians and patients and their interactions, and making sure that they're involved in the process going forward. And so what I see as modernization is not of clinical trials, seeing them as completely separate from the modernization of clinical practice, but I see it as building an ecosystem of improving how we take care of patients and how patients feel like they're involved in that care process. And it might be sort of abstract and blue skyish when I say these things, but there are like clear, like deliverable things that we can do to get to that place. It's not even rocket science. It's almost a very straightforward policy moves to get to a place where that process is embedded. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Rin. Interesting. You call it blue skying, or I might call it a vision. And it might be something that, given we need a very high level and a very motivating vision, I hope many of your ideas are included in that, frankly. Next on our list, and thank you, Srin, for that. And I keep reminding people, please put your questions in the Q&A if you're willing to do it. Allison, your turn.
Thank you, Graham. Your question was, what does modernization look like to you? And after listening to our colleagues here, to me, it looks like Heidi and Srin, honestly. The investigator and the patient partners together, that is the way of the future. And I'm just so, feel so privileged to be here in this conversation with them. But my prepared notes were that modernization to me looks like a clinical trial ecosystem that's flexible, agile, streamlined, collaborative, and effective. All of those things we heard this week in one way or another, that they were important and that we're moving that way and we need to move that way. And this is all supported by technology, access to data, and led by patients, caregivers, and healthcare providers. I think really central to this is a culture change from one where we actually view clinical trials as experiments on humans, but in fact, it really is just gathering new information on how to help patients achieve better health outcomes. So we've been hearing that throughout the week, and I think that really is the future. Clinical trials will be patient-centric, and our community will all work together in support of this. I do want to reflect back to Jean's comment about the regulations and the upcoming E8R1 that's in draft, and talk to Jean anytime more about this. But really key is that the regulatory guidances will instruct everyone in working in clinical trials, in industry, investigators, all the partners, that you should be seeking patient input at the planning, design, the conduct, and analysis phase of trials. So what Heidi said, from start to finish, we're going to see that as part of our modernization and our future. Thank you.
Thank you, Allison. And I'm really quite struck. Well, I love the way that you have expressed what you hope will be the future of modernization. And I want to relate that back to Jean Smart's comments earlier about the how. Now is the time that we are to take action and how we do it. So I wonder if people have given thought to the simple challenge that we're not doing those things right now, at least not to the extent that we wish that they should be done. So how do we influence the people that we work with, the people who are going to have to take the responsibility for making those changes, to shift course and do the how, the way it's being described? Does anybody want to comment on that? And I know I sprung that question on you. It's not a question that I gave you advance notice of, but I think it is an important question, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on it.
Graham?
Take a crack.
And I haven't forgotten you, Cindy. I haven't forgotten you.
I'll take a quick crack. I think it's a big culture change. and I think it has to be across the province and probably across Canada. I would love to be able to walk into an institution, a healthcare institution, and walk over the threshold and see something that says we do research and we care for you. And I'd love to see that in every department, in every unit, and on the front door of every building in British Columbia.
Yeah.
How's that for a start?
All right, there's a start. That's an excellent start. And I won't belabor the point, but that is something that I think we need to really think long and hard about moving forward, is that how do you change culture?
Yeah.
Because it isn't an easy task. Cindy,
Right,
your
thank
turn.
you. And Jean, that was a perfect segue into how I'm going to start. In a modern health system, clinical trials are a standard and expected part of healthcare and quality improvement in our hospitals, and also more widespread in the community, including in the primary care networks and the nurse practitioner clinics. Clinical trial capacity building efforts at health authorities are considered learning health system performance indicators, reportable to the Minister of Health as an expectation in the mandate letters that health authority leaders receive every year. And this becomes a publicly visible part of our government's health and innovation commitment to the citizens of British Columbia. It also means that health authority infrastructure that enables trials is appropriately resourced, with an accountability for efficiency and sustainability, driven by things like streamlined and coordinated processes for operational review and widespread use of shared platforms. And helping that sustainability is the CIHR, enabling health authorities to receive indirects to support their research infrastructure too. Clinical trial modernization involves our universities, with graduates in the medical professions and other health-related programs exposed to trials as career paths before they graduate. When hired, these professionals are primed to work in a health system that offers patients clinical trial opportunities as part of their care in a wide range of disease areas across urban and rural settings. Job descriptions of health authority care providers and decision makers include clinical trials, and their professional bodies and institutions recognize and support these competencies. Clinical trials in the future will fully incorporate equity, diversity, and inclusion. Modernized trials mean that cultural safety and humility is woven into the fabric of trial conduct, a process achieved through understanding the heavy bootprints of colonialism on the system of the past and the trauma inflicted on Indigenous people by the horrible experiments conducted in Indian hospitals in BC not so long ago. In the future, we will have worked hard to build trust and partnership with Indigenous people with humility. In our modern system, patient-oriented research principles are applied from the get-go when protocols for both real-world and registration studies are developed, and throughout the whole cycle of conduct and knowledge translation. Modernization means that trials are an integrated part of a learning health system in BC, helping to both accelerate diagnostic and treatment innovations into care and enabling evidence-informed decision-making in care and service delivery. So in essence, trials will be a noticeable enabler of the quadruple aim of healthcare: better outcomes and experience for patients, improved experience for our providers, better health and wellness for our communities, and enhanced value to the health system.
Wow, Cindy, thank you. That was a very complete response to the question. I'm really intrigued by the notion that you did phrase your last few sentences in terms of outcomes, not processes. And I wonder if I could ask you why you did that. Like, many times we emphasize the things we should be doing, not the results we should be achieving.
Yeah, thank you. That kind of ties into the goals of the health system overall. And everything we do in the health system, and how we conduct ourselves as leaders, and how we organize our structures and processes and work with each other, needs to aim for improving outcomes, for improving experience for patients. And we have to do this in a way that's sustainable as well. We know there's not unlimited resources in the health system. we need to look forward to what's coming in the future. We need to align the priorities of research with the health system to reach these goals. If we don't, if the research community doesn't come together around working within and integrated in the health system, we will continue to have some of this disconnect that we have. So, so it's all part of that integration and the coming together of these two worlds in this new era.
Coming together of two worlds, that is the challenge, isn't it? I'm going to ask the audience now. We've heard from the second of the group of 4 panel members to share their thoughts on what modernization looks like to them. I'm going to ask the audience to please present us with some questions or comments that we can respond to. One of the things that I can certainly put to you in this, while I'm waiting for questions to appear, is if you were establishing targets related to some of the goals that you have articulated, what would some of those targets maybe look like to you? Can you have targets in, for example, diversity and inclusion? Is there value in putting such targets forward?
Graham, I think there is, and developing them needs to be very collaborative with the community, with the health system, with researchers. Setting targets is part of achieving results. And we can set a direction, but we need them to be realistic. We need them to be reflective of what we can do together over time. There's a lot of learning, a lot of education, and a lot of self-reflection involved for everybody in the health system to move towards the integration of equity, diversity, and inclusion. It's not just the research community, it's the health system overall. So I think together that is something that we can do. And support each other and also hold ourselves accountable that way.
Others want to comment on that? Allison, I see you nodding. Do you have a perspective?
Not on that specifically, Graham. I was actually reading the comment from Heather Harris, who was very involved in some of the early days of the conversations we're having around BC CREN. So I was just reading her comment and nodding to that. Thank you, Heather.
Well, maybe what I could ask you to do, Allison, is it something of value to the whole group that you could read out to us?
Her comment was around how much power there is in collaboration, how wonderful it is to see the work that's being done through the conference to bring everybody together, really to bring information, and also a shout out to SPORE Networks for their work in engaging patient partners in all aspects.
Thank you, thank you. And I did have that up to comment on, but I'm glad you were able to do it. Heidi, I think I saw you sort of indicate that you might respond to my target question.
Well, I think I have more questions. Honestly, I don't have any answers, but my question, I suppose, is there a way we can kind of flip the answering of that diversity question in review processes and ask people to justify why they can't meet targets instead of how they can? So it's maybe a naive question, but asking questions in a way that elicits better investigation from investigators and designers of these trials.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Heidi. I have colleagues in New Zealand who, when, say, for pregnant individuals, if they are not included in their study, they have to have a formal justification as to why not. In Canada, we have the opposite approach, i.e. we need a formal justification as to why we have to include them. In New Zealand, they have a formal process for inclusion of the Maori in all clinical trials, and then there's a why not, haven't you included them more? Here, obviously, we haven't built those frameworks yet, or at least are at the beginning parts of those frameworks. And so I think we have a lot to learn from other places who have a more advanced approach to these kinds of things than we do.
Thanks, Rin. That's important, and I could follow up that by saying what in your experience as people who have interacted with other jurisdictions. I know, Rob, you have, for example, on multiple occasions, Gavin as well. What are some of the lessons that we can consider bringing into the modernization process from outside the province of British Columbia?
Well, I'll just offer one comment to that, Graham. I was very intrigued with Professor Hackshaw's comment. Cancer Research UK is expecting most of these new trials to not only have a data safety monitoring committee, but also a patient and partner committee that monitors the trial and oversees that and assesses the results. He also made the comment in the question and answer period that it wasn't just a question of setting targets for EDI, but that it should be the responsibility of the investigators working with the patient and partner monitoring committee to set those EDI targets as well, because it may be that one size doesn't fit all. So yes, there should be targets, but they may be individualized. I was quite impressed by the thoughtfulness of that approach.
And what was interesting too was yesterday, and I can't remember who the speaker was, who talked about the fact that you've got to have targets in individual clinical trials, but you've also got to roll them up or have targets at different levels of the system. So indeed, if you're going to have a systemic response to modernization, then you need systemic targets as well as individual targets for individual clinical trials or groups of clinical trials. But having said that, we're now having a few questions pop in, and I want to bring them to your attention as a panel. The first is from Robert Taylor, who says at the CCTG level, most trials do not currently capture ethnicity of trial participants. So it's impossible to look at diversity retrospectively. I am a patient rep with the CCTG, and it feels like changing this is pushing a rope. A comment, not a question, but does anybody want to respond to that? And we have 1 more minute, so before we go on to the poll, so it's a quick response.
So I'm going to take probably Sven, you go ahead.
Thanks, Danielle. Go ahead.
I'll fumble this one and then pass it to Sven for the touchdown. I think we have to be thoughtful about diversity. So pragmatic clinical trials are intended to have the question address the populations for which answers are needed, and they should be reflective of the population. So being thoughtful about who you're trying to bring into the study, what you're trying to assess, and to make sure that the study question is applicable to broader populations that are typically found in clinical trials, randomized clinical trials, where there's more restrictive inclusion and exclusion criteria. In terms of capturing the different types of data or how we categorize people, I think we need to be thoughtful about what the intent is and why that information is biologically related to the question at hand, or what conclusions we're attempting to draw from that type of data. So I think that's one piece around why we're capturing certain variables and what that will do to inform the research that we're conducting. I think broader to equity, diversity, and inclusion, I think that has to happen on so many different levels. So from our fundamental who our researchers are and who are in our education streams and being trained to be researchers, that should be reflective of the populations who we serve. Our clinicians, our nurses, our staff should be reflective of the communities that we serve. So I think and our patient partners, right? We have to expand our engagement of people who are hardly represented, not underrepresented. They're just not people that we're engaging effectively into our systems. And why is that? Why are the environments that we are creating not inviting of those individuals to come and be part of our tables? What can we do to better expand our networks? And that's on us to do. So I think this concept of EDI, it is about reaching targets, but it's also setting an environment where people want to participate too. So that's my fumbly answer. But Sren, I welcome your thoughts or additions.
I'm not sure if I have a touchdown after that pass, Danielle. I will say that as a researcher, you want your results to be generalizable to the larger community. At the same time, Canada has a very sort of not perfect history of collecting this type of data and using it for purposes that may not reflect the needs of the individuals it's being collected from. And so as we build a framework to do these things, I think it's absolutely fundamental that we sort of have a very clear perspective on the data, what it means, and what we're hoping to do with it. That involves the communities that we're collecting it from. And I think that's would help with the things you mentioned, Danielle, about making sure people feel engaged with the questions and wanting to participate. Once again, taking research away from that sort of away from the clinical practice world and directly in it.
Thank you both for taking on that particular comment and question, because it is an issue that has plagued us for many a year. It's not unique to clinical trials. It's unique to society, I guess, and it's not one that's going to be solved quickly. At this point, audience, I'd like to invite you to join us in filling out a live poll. The live poll button you will see on the right-hand side of your screen. And we've opened that poll now, and it essentially is asking you to respond to a question in one of three ways. The question is as follows. Based on everything that you've heard from the panel members, based on your own reactions to everything you've heard during the conference, and your own experience with the pace and the challenges of change, what level of challenge does modernization of clinical trials in BC present to us? And you're given three options. First option is modernization is a matter of making minor adjustments to current practice. Not everybody, just some people. Choice two is it is a complicated change that will require some major shifts in practice and much collaboration across the province. And I see people are filling this in wildly already. And three, modernization is a transformational change that will produce clinical trial system very different to what we currently have. Now, can all the panel members see the responses to the survey? I think it is very interesting to see that option number one does not get a lot of adherence out there. Small incremental change is not what people are looking to see. I'm a bit surprised at the number of people that have responded to number three. And it would be fantastic to find out, I'm sorry we can't, whether those are some of the patients in the audience or some of the researchers in the audience, because obviously we have different perspectives. But the simple fact that the great majority of people have chosen number two does lay out the kind of scope and breadth of the challenge facing us all. And I want to remind us of Bev Pomeroy's comment yesterday that moving ahead, it's going to be co-creative. It's going to be something that we all have to do. Now, I note from time that our session ends in 30 minutes. And what I've asked the panel members to do is to think about how they react to that question. But not only to the poll results, but not only how they react to them, but what's one thing that they're going to do to take on the challenge of change that is presented by those poll results? And in 5 minutes, I'm going to ask them to share their results with you in the same order that we did the previous sessions, starting with Gavin. And that gives each of you a 4-minute break to go to the washroom, whatever you need to do. You have 4 minutes to let the panel contemplate the implications of the poll. And we're going to reconvene our session in exactly 4 minutes at 3:05. Okay? Thank you.
Graham, so all the audience will be able to see the results now of the poll?
And panel member, question just came in for you to contemplate too, which is poll question be limited to BC? This is at least a national issue. So I guess if we were to ask people across Canada, we might get a slightly different response, but not likely. You know, you can take a break too, panel. You can get a glass of water, whatever you want. Sure it is. Results. Both their perspective on the results and one thing that they're prepared to do to begin the modernization process moving forward. And I'm going to start with Gavin. Gavin?
So thanks very much, Graham. And I must confess, I'm not surprised by the results of the poll. I see three key words in the three choices: minor, complicated, or transformational. And I think, as we have demonstrated in Canada, change is readily achievable in the COVID crisis, but there has to be a sense of urgency. And I don't pretend we've done a home run with COVID research, but there sure have been a lot of changes that have taken place in a short period of time, which tells me, to a large extent, the processes are there. It's the people that need to change and look at this differently. And so I do think it's complicated. One can argue, I go back to the use of the lexicon, is it transformational or complicated? I'd say it's complicated. Therefore, the poll results don't surprise me. One thing I'm going to do, and we do have a process within the Cancer Agency for clinical trials conduct, and I will be pushing hard for patient monitoring committees on new phase 3 trials. I think that's an excellent idea and something that we can implement tomorrow.
Thank you, Gavin. It's important to point out that change requires behavior change. If we all do the same thing tomorrow that we did today, then nothing will change. So at the end of the day, for modernization to happen, all of us have to change our behavior somehow. And that is why we've asked this last question. And we're going to ask it of the audience very shortly, what they're prepared to do as well. Second on the list is Danielle.
As I read the answers, I am not surprised either. But it's interesting, I don't think too much of your complicated change and transformational change are mutually exclusive. I think if you can get the complicated change fixed, then it'll be a transformational change as well. And I do think that the complicated component to some extent is we have to be willing to let go of power in some instances. I think, you know, we hold things close in terms of our processes and our expertise. And I think sharing that and recognizing that in health systems change and in complex interventions, there is not one person who can do that by themselves, who can design the study, who can conduct the study, who can synthesize the results. You really do need an interdisciplinary team that comprises patients, clinicians, people in clinical practice, health authority leadership, policymakers. You need that robust team to move it forward. So I think for us to accomplish that, people do have to be willing to let go of some of the power they've traditionally held and bring other people to the table. So one thing I'm committed to do, and I think I'm very fortunate to be part of an organization that gets to help bring those networks together. So I look forward to taking the lessons that we've learned throughout the conference, and in particular yesterday, to partner with Allison and to partner with Terry at Research Ethics BC to really see that come to tangible. If that's having more conversations and working with our different partners to help bring this forward, then I certainly look forward to being part of that process.
Thanks very much, Danielle. It's interesting and I think Gavin got at this, to debate the difference between the words complicated and transformation. Sometimes people think that changing culture is transformational because it's not a scientific process, whereas complicated means science is heavily involved in the process. But that's just one perspective. Rob, your turn.
So, I mean, we've talked a lot about innovation, and, you know, we've been referred to, and this I think is really global, is that we're a sea or an island of pilot projects. And a big piece of innovation is actually implementation of innovation. And that is a challenge both at the bureaucracy side, because it is a change with just what we're talking about, and also to bring forward the evidence that it actually leads to better outcomes. What Howard Feldman brought up, if those were listening to the first talk yesterday morning, was there's also needs to be change to stop doing things that we have evidence that are not proving useful. And I think that's even more difficult, to make room for innovation. It's a two-way pathway, is that we need to ensure that we're assessing what is, you know, standard practice. Is there a better way of doing it, and to drop some of the things that perhaps innovation will lead to a better solution. So it is a lot of work. It's both a cultural change, you know, a bureaucratic change. We all talk about barriers or hurdles to jump. So I view it as both complicated and also transformational. We need that culture change. And we've seen that with COVID, not just with research, but also with other aspects of care, that it can be done. And we've got to keep on that ahead of the wave of change to ensure that we're prepared for the future.
And one thing, Rob, that you would commit to doing?
Oh, I think it is breaking down the barriers for innovation to be implemented back in the system at scale. We've got to get away from pilot projects and bring them in at scale.
Fascinating. Thank you. Jane.
Okay, I'm had a hard time deciding, but I think I can commit to education. And by that, I mean the regulatory interpretation and application at the quality risk and the support level. That's what I can commit to.
Thank you. Did the poll results surprise you, Jean?
No, because I've been watching it, the regulations that they've been implemented across the globe, and you know that they've already been done in Europe. So I think that the reaction, even though we've had 4 or 5 years to get ready for this, I think that it's been a bit of a struggle from the resource perspective, from a culture perspective, but I think that everybody's really ready for the change. So maybe it will go smoother than we think.
Thank you very much. I didn't realize that you'd been thinking about this for over 5 years. And see, this is Not being part of your community, I did not know that. And maybe that explains that this is now the urgency for action. We need to do something. Heidi, your turn.
I am not surprised by the poll results. I think you'd be surprised if I were surprised. The things, and what I will do, well, I'll continue to challenge the status quo. Specifically, what I would like to do is kind of volunteer my voice to help break down barriers between, for example, between health authorities and the province, because a lot of the projects that I've been involved in, that's been a major problem to them. And so if there are any opportunities where I can help with that, I think a patient voice has a particularly powerful, can be a particularly powerful addition to that conversation.
Thank you, Heidi. It's most certainly the, I think the conference has shown that the people who put this together are willing to have the status quo challenged. I think they've shown that, and it's now a matter of figuring out how to deal with challenges in a constructive way. Sren, you're next.
Yes, like thinking about what I would do, I guess is the question. I think advocacy of the importance of this, I think, is crucial to leaders as well as everybody across the larger community. I think both from a value for money perspective, from a patient engagement in their own care perspective, and then a ultimately improving how patients do from their illness or disease perspective. This is how we get to those goals, and advocating for that is going to be, I guess, my task going forward.
Thanks, Sren. Appreciate those comments, and I think you're experiencing on a day-to-day basis, aren't you, in terms of what you have embedded in your clinical trial processes. So now, Allison, your turn.
Thank you. Earlier in the conference, Seren, you mentioned about tackling these challenges head on, and that just got me to thinking about, and you mentioned, Jean, and a lot of us have been talking about these changes for a number of years that are needed. But oftentimes in the clinical trial community on the ground, we've had to actually, although we're talking about it and we want to make some of these changes, find more workarounds than actually be able to push the change forward that's needed. Rather than tackling it head on, it's like, well, we need to get this project done. We need to figure out how to do it. So we find a lot of workarounds to do that. Now I feel like together with a community, with the expressions of everybody's sort of commitment to change, and perhaps COVID-19 has really helped to move this forward so that we feel that together we actually can affect some change that's we know is needed, and that we're not doing this alone. And so that's just sort of my reflection. I'm not surprised by the poll. And there are many days sort of in the trenches where I felt like we needed a 3, but I think 2 is definitely the place where we want to land. And one of the commitments I will make, we talked about this in the patient engagement session, we're going to build a patient engagement in clinical trials community of practice, and we will move that forward. And if anybody would like to join, please reach out to myself or Larry at the support unit. Thank you.
Thank you, Allison. It's interesting you say that, you've been doing a lot of workarounds. Turning workarounds into process may be part of the challenge, so that you don't have to do as many workarounds to operationalize what you know has to be done. So that's just something to keep in mind. Cindy, your turn.
Great, thank you. I'm with the 30%. And that's because the health system that clinical trials are a part of is complex. And to get where we're going, we need to understand that and align with it as it works to transform to meet the challenges of the future. We need to transform as it transforms. Think, for example, the shift from acute to community care. So the many issues we face to modernize trials involves diverse stakeholders, multiple layers, and many constantly moving and interconnected parts that are hard to untangle. So I commit as a health system leader to continuously develop and apply my skills to lead the changes that we need and to see them through a complexity lens.
Thank you, Cindy. You're on that transformation realm and you know a little about it. And I think it is a combination of 2 and 3, actually. There are aspects of the challenge that are transformational, and some of those are cultural, and some of those are mental. And the complicated challenges are more structural in process. But we'll see how that plays out. It's a massive challenge at level 2 or 3. So I really appreciate also the individual commitments that you made. I think those are very important. We have 12 minutes left. I have one question that emerged from the Q&A for panel. And then I'm going to ask the audience to share what they're willing to do with us in terms of, in the spirit of co-creation, in the spirit of working together, they're prepared to do to help the transition process, the change process go forward. But many fans asked the question, can the panelists comment on the implications and possibly the strategies related to the poll results? Volunteer? Allison?
As I kind of alluded to that in my comments, so I will add to that a little bit, and then I would ask for reflections from the panel members here. More concrete example would be if you are in a clinical trial within the healthcare setting and you're trying to support your patient participants through that journey. For example, offering them compensation or reimbursement for expenses and their participation. Yet the policies within that healthcare organization you're working within don't permit this type of process to happen. So you as a coordinator or research nurse really need to move that forward. But how do you do that when you don't necessarily have the ear or that culture that you're working within that's supporting you? So I would, in response to Manny, that's sort of a concrete example. So what would be the suggestion? What should that person do in that situation to tackle change?
I think
Volunteer?
Oh,
Cindy?
sorry. It needs to be through that engagement and the connections with the other people working in the system that have to work in alignment to allow clinical trials to happen. You know, it's not just clinical trial units, and I can see there's a question there about the teams at the sites that are working on the front lines. But if we think about what happens, and Allison touched into the compensation piece, the finance system in health authorities and in research we're a square peg in a round hole, and that's a prime example of workaround. But if we look at the other services that we need to do trials, it's imaging, it's lab, it's pharmacy. So it goes, and when we talk about resourcing, the stabilization of resourcing in a healthcare system that's facing so many fiscal constraints, there's lots of discussion that goes on continuously between our frontline, I know, and managers and others within the organization to try to address that. So there's a community that the sites work with in the system that also needs to be part of those discussions for change, and that's underway. And I would encourage it to continue and to draw upon your leadership skills, including how things land when conversations are challenging and you're faced with that pushback about, you know, there's just not enough resources, so the research has to wait. That's something that we face, I think, more broadly within the healthcare system in Canada too.
Would anybody else like? Gavin?
Yeah, I might just offer a comment. It picks up a little bit on what Rob was saying about us being a nation of pilot projects. And I I think there is a role for sort of, I think Manny asked the question about tackling the challenge at the frontline worker sort of level. And there's an opportunity for that and individuals making a difference. But there does need to be system implementation as well. And I mean, I think the part of that is this conversation. When was the last time we had more than 500 people in British Columbia engaged discussing clinical trials? I mean, this is kind of the start of that conversation, getting the people together, looking at the large picture, and it's going to have to be a multi-pronged or multifaceted approach to make that change, however complicated or transformational we think it will be.
Thank you very much, Gavin. And at this point, I would really encourage members of the audience, if you would like to go into the discussion forum and indicate to us as panel members who are put their lives on the line here. They've stated what they're willing to do. What are some of you willing to do? What do you think your next step would be to support this initiative?
I mean, I think another piece, talking about 500 participants, is looking at them. I think it's throughout BC, and it is a challenge to have clinical trials on accessibility throughout BC. And I think that is, technology can add to it. We've talked a lot about that. But I think it's also looking at BC as, as the whole. Geographically is what makes BC so beautiful, but it's also a challenge of accessibility. And I do think that's another area that, for the accessibility for clinical trials, that is an area that, it's not that we haven't talked about this, but I think now through technology, we can probably go a lot further on that. I think Heidi said she's from the Kootenays, I think she said. It's a long way from where I'm sitting in Vancouver. But there's not reason, that's not an excuse not to be inclusive.
Absolutely true. Just want to point out something Heather Harris has put in the chat box that you may or may not have had a chance to read. But she says, one thing I've learned in working with the patient-oriented research space is that our patient partners' timelines are not the same as those of the research enterprise and usual process. For patients, new treatments or modalities can be matters of life and death and or quality of life. We need to see how we can keep the COVID efficiencies for trial startup and implementation and apply these to other therapeutic areas. We owe this to our patient partners. I think that is a very important, maybe ending point, if you like, for the session. Unless I'm going to give each panel member the opportunity if you would like to give a closing remark. But I would say that a really big challenge that we face is doing what some of the panel members said this morning, which is taking the lessons of COVID and institutionalizing them in our practices moving forward, rather than letting us snap back to how we used to behave before COVID. Because many of those processes are the kinds of processes that are fueling the very introspection that the clinical trials group has brought to this conference. And I think that's very, very important for us to consider. So panel members, do you have a final comment you would like to make to the audience? Gavin?
I don't think so, Graham. I just spoke.
Okay. Anybody else?
I would encourage
Cindy.
People, everybody out there, be bold, take risks, do experiments on the ways that you're doing things to try to make them better all the time. And if it doesn't work, monitor that, abandon it. But I think Heather's comment about COVID, we were bold. And Mary this morning was talking about, what did the Ministry of Health do? We mobilized quickly. We tried things, and if it didn't work, we moved away from it and we moved to something else. That's what we need to do. We need to do a lot of it concurrently in many of the areas that we just discussed. So be bold, do it, and watch what happens. Respond, drop, or amplify what's working.
Thank you. Heidi.
So I absolutely love that. And don't wait to fix something so that you have a perfect solution. an adequate solution is, or you can do it stepwise. And if you don't change because you don't have a perfect solution, you'll never implement anything.
Thanks, Heidi. Allison, did I see you with your hand up?
No, but I'll go. Yeah. I did have a final comment, really, that many of the problems are not new, especially in other jurisdictions and other parts of Canada, other parts of the world. So it's not something we only need to solve. We've heard that from some of our comments in the session today and throughout the week, but globally. So hopefully we can also reach out and learn from our colleagues that and watch what they do also to address some of the challenges we see. Thank you.
Anybody else?
I'll say something.
Yes, Jane.
In the whole life cycle of products, and I think we can't forget the foundational piece, which is core research. And if we don't have that, we don't have anything to offer anybody.
Mhm.
Thank you, Jane. And maybe I could end by saying that I want to emphasize that the modernization process, which is upon us, it's not something we're just contemplating, has a role for everyone, not just the panel members, but everyone in the audience. If we keep doing things the way we've been doing them, we will fall behind other national and international jurisdictions, and we won't bring the benefits of clinical trials to British Columbia in the way that our citizens need it to be brought to them. We need to modernize, or we're going to become irrelevant. So I encourage all of you, step up, take on a role, and let's see the vision, some of the elements of which we've seen in this call, operationalized over the next coming years. I want to thank you all for being part of this session, panel members in particular for working so hard throughout the conference, and the audience for being attentive. And I want to also emphasize the summary of the conference will be shared with all attendees, and there is every intention of turning this into some actions that will move this process forward. Thanks very much, everybody. And don't forget to sign out and then sign back in for the final session. Take care.
Thank you, Graham.